Hi guys, James at Rampant Lion Reviews again for you today with another beer review. For this one, we are going to stick to Sweden and we're going to return to a brewery that's featured on the channel a couple of times before. I've had some really nice beers from these guys over the last year or two. This brewery is still a relatively new addition to the Swedish craft beer scene, but the beers that I've had have been pretty solid. I think it's fair to say that this brewery are best known for their different New England hazy IPAs, although they have been doing a number of different fruity juicy sours recently and one or two darker things as well. Now, the beer that we're going to have a look at today is a style that I've had from them once before. I did enjoy that particular beer, but this one I've heard is even better than that. So I have to say, I'm quite curious to see how this one turns out, because this is a brewery that's kind of quite widely regarded as a sort of up and coming one here in Sweden. So worth checking out if you get the chance to try some of their beers. But hopefully this is another good one. Hopefully it makes for an interesting review. And as always, I hope that you guys enjoy my take on this one as well. So yeah, for this review then, we are going to head to Karlstad, which is on the banks of Vänern in Värmland County, kind of to the northeastish a little bit of Gothenburg, Göteborg on the Swedish west coast. But we're going to have a look at another beer from Hands Brewing. So this particular beer is called Scarecrow. It comes in at 12.5% ABV, so it's a little bit of a monster. It's an Imperial Stout, and this one was released as part of the Local Osmoskarigt assortment through Systembolaget here in Sweden for April of 2022. So yeah, I've seen this beer described as an Imperial pastry stout, but from what I understand, it doesn't have any adjuncts in it. It is more just a kind of straight up barley malt and oat Imperial Stout. So this should be very, very interesting, but the name of this one and the artwork just kind of caught my eye, and I know that 10 Hands are pretty damn solid with everything that they do, so I thought this would be a nice one to check out, and I've only reviewed one Imperial Stout from them before as well. That was another plus point for this beer. But as I said earlier, curious to see what it's got in store for us, so let's crack on and see what we have here. So, as always with my reviews then, I'll tell you a little bit about the brewery before we taste the beer. If you want to get straight to the tasting, just fast forward. All the usual links are in the video description below. That's the brewery website, the link to my other reviews that I've done from 10 Hands Brewing before, and we will no doubt review more from these guys at some point in the near future. But there's all the usual social media down there. If you want to see more reviews, do please consider subscribing to the channel. The whole channel, of course, has a geography-based tagging system, so you can go into the homepage and search for beer based on country, city, state, county, province, prefecture, whatever it is you happen to be interested in. Do check out the playlists of beers from different countries. There is one there for all the Swedish beers that I've reviewed for you. That's constantly being added to. And as always, please do get in touch and let me know some of the other beers and breweries that you guys would like to see me review. It's always great to hear from you guys that are watching the videos, and the support that you show the channel is hugely appreciated. So anyway, on to my brewery notes then to tell you a little bit about 10 Hands Brewing then. So 10 Hands Brewing, 10 Hands Brewery, whatever you want to call them, are based in Karlstad on the banks of Vänern in Värmland County, just a little bit to the northeast of Gothenburg. Vänern, of course, is one of the two Great Lakes of Sweden. But the company was founded by a group of 5 friends. So the 5 guys behind this company are Robert Hedel, Johan Eklund, Fredrik Steen, Göran Larsson and Jan Karlsson, and all of these guys own a 20% share of the company, which was founded back officially in November of 2018. The fact that there are 5 of them behind the company is the main reason behind the whole 10 Hands thing. But all of these guys have a little bit of brewing experience, although it is Johan Eklund who is the main brewer. They released their first beer in March of 2019, which was an IPA called Firstborn. I believe they haven't released that yet through Systembolaget, unfortunately, but that is something that I would like to have a little look at here on the channel. But that year in 2019, they produced around 20,000 litres of beer in total. But they started releasing their beers through Systembolaget in 2020. I think it was around March or April maybe, that they started releasing their beers that year. And over the following years, they have kind of expanded the capacity of the brewery a little bit, expanded their fermentation capacity, brewed new recipes, and just got their beer out there a little bit more. But as of May 2022, when I'm filming this review for you, these guys have produced around 65 different kinds of beer according to Untappd, And as I said, the main beer that these guys kind of focus on is the New England Hazy IPA, although they have been releasing a good few sort of Berliner Weisse, Gose, big fruity juicy sour things, and you will get an Imperial Stout from them every so often as well. But yeah, that is all I can really tell you about 10 Hands Brewing for the moment, 10 Hands Brewery. They are still very new to the scene, so I'm sure we will be able to add more to these notes at some point in the near future. But yeah, if you want to learn more about these guys, you can check out the brewery website, you can follow them on Facebook and Instagram to keep up to date with all the latest goings on, and you can check out the Rate Beer, Untappd and Beer Advocate pages to learn a little bit more about all the different beers that they've done thus far. So yeah, let's crack on and have a little look at the beer itself. So I'll just let you have a little look at the artwork on this one before we open it up. As you can see there, it's pretty interesting. It actually reminds me of that film, I don't know if it's Tim Burton or not, but that film 9 that's about the, you know, the ragdoll, the sort of ragdolls that carry the spark of life. I'm pretty sure that is Tim Burton, but not 100% sure. But the artwork on this one really does remind me of that. The artist for these guys, incidentally, is Ukrainian. Her name's Violetta, but yeah, she's very, very talented, of course. You can see on the back of the can there is the 10 Hands Brewery symbol. Apparently this is called Mr. Fingers, but yeah, as I've said in many of these 10 Hands Brewing reviews before, it reminds me of the character Yivo from the Futurama, the Futurama film, The Beast with a Billion Backs. So yeah, pretty cool. But as we said earlier, this one is a 12.5% Imperial Stout. I believe I paid like 45 Swedish kronor for this one, so that is about €4.50, maybe about £3.75, £4 sterling, something like that, I guess in the region of like $6 American. But you can see plain silver top on the can there. This is one of these kind of thin Red Bull 330ml cans, of course. But yeah, this one, I have seen it listed on Untappd as an Imperial Pastry Stout, but it is just a bit of barley malt and oat that's in this one, rather than lots of adjuncts and stuff like that. So this should be quite nice, actually. The last Imperial Stout I had from these guys was called Black Celebration, and I think that was brewed for their 2nd anniversary, if I'm not mistaken. But yeah, this may well be the strongest beer that I've had from them so far at 12.5%. But let's just crack on with it and see how we go. Should be a very, very nice one. So the Scarecrow 12.5% ABV Imperial Stout from 10 Hands Brewing in Karlstad, Värmland, here in Sweden. Let's get this guy out and into the glass. Here we go. So, there we are. Ooh. This should hopefully be a very, very nice beer. It certainly poured very, very nicely. So let me just put this back in place so that my OCD is happy. I do love the artwork on these beers, by the way. But yeah, anyway, this looks very, very good. So before the head disappears on this one, you can see that it's poured with, I would say, a 2/3 finger, frothy, kind of light beige head. You can see the bubbles in that though are very light and kind of you know, very light and very, very small actually. But as you would expect from an Imperial Stout of any variety really, this has poured a lovely dark ebony rosewood colour. There are 1 or 2 big bubbles sticking toward the side of the glass and 1 or 2 little ones going up toward the bottom of the head, but really the beer does not have that much in the way of visible carbonation. It really looks like a very, very calm Imperial Stout. There are 1 or 2 little teeny bits of sediment floating around in the bottom of this one, but yeah, with an Imperial Stout you don't need to care so much about that. These beers will last for a very, very long time. But yeah, colour wise, I think it's fair to say this one is a very dark ebony rosewood colour. If we shine the light through it, it does have a little tiny hint of a sort of Pepsi, Coca-Cola coloured edge to it, but yeah, not letting a lot of light through. Now remember, the colour of these beers depends on 1, the type of malts that you use. This goes a long way to determining the EBC rating. 2, the length of your wort boil is also going to play a role, because the longer you boil the wort, the more the sugars caramelise, and thus you get a darker colour of beer. Any adjuncts that you put in, or any barrel aging that you do, will affect the colour of the beer too. But when it comes to Imperial Stouts, to be honest, it's quite difficult to affect the colour of them with either of those last 2 variables that we mentioned there. But what I will say is that probably a good little bit of the opacity, the opaqueness of this beer will be due to the fact that there are oats in this, because when we talk about a lot of beers, wheat and oats play a big role, along with the yeast, in terms of how hazy the beer is going to be. But yeah, this one, you can see it's not even got that much of a kind of coloured edge to it, if you like, when we shine the light through it. But in terms of what you would expect appearance wise from an Imperial Stout, there's nothing particularly surprising about this one. So yeah, I don't think we really need to say anything else about the appearance of this beer. We can go on and just have a little look at the aroma then. Yeah, so let's do this. Oh, that's quite interesting, I have to say. Yeah. Now, this is really quirky for me. So, this beer has a little bit of that kind of phenolic element to it. It almost smells a little bit like Skittles in some way. Yeah, you do get Skittles in Sweden, I'm pretty sure. But it really has, that's the first thing I get from this beer, is this really candied Skittle-like aroma. And I've had it in a few beers before. We had it in one from Fierce Beer in Scotland. It was a collaboration with Dugisbrigger. It's this big triple IPA, but the aroma of this one is really, really similar to that. And I've no idea what causes it, but I didn't quite expect that from this beer. It must be the interaction of the yeast with one of the malt varieties or something like that. But this beer really has this kind of candy, sort of phenolic type thing. It almost reminds me a little bit of some of the triples I've had. It's a wee bit of a cross between Skittles, as we say, and, you know, sort of Cavonia, you know, throat medicine kind of thing. Really unusual. That's the first thing that I get out of this beer, actually. But if we talk about the beer overall, to me it smells like quite a sweet and thick Imperial Stout. But it's very, as I say, it's just very, very candied, to be honest with you. I'm not getting much in the way of hoppy notes. A little bit of fruitiness, and as I say, a big kind of almost like phenolic backbone to it. It's a really unusual first impression of this beer that we've had so far. But yeah, let's try and break this aroma down properly and just see if we can get anything else out of it. But this is definitely one of the most quirky Imperial Stouts I've come across in terms of aroma in recent times. But yeah, if all the beers were the same, we wouldn't be reviewing them here on Rampant Lion Reviews, would we? We do like beers that test us a little bit. So yeah, let's take a proper look at the aroma and see what we get. So we'll sugar it up a little bit and just see what we can get out of this aroma. Yeah, so I'm going to say absolutely. I can see why a lot of people would describe this one as a pastry stout, because it does have this kind of almost cakey backbone to it. It smells a little bit like some of these kind of boozy, you know, brandy infused fruitcakes. It's got a lot of that going on. So when you take the aroma in a little bit more deeply, you've got a little bit of a roast. You do get a little touch of roasty, toasty backbone, but as I say, there's quite a big bready, cakey note to this one. It's got a good bit of like brandy, almost cognac-y, like fruity cake, fruit loaf sort of thing to it. So yeah, a wee bit of toasty bread crust, big boozy kind of bready, cakey notes, and you know it has a good element of these kind of. It does have a good element of that, you know, highly caramelized, brown sugary character to it as well. So yeah, the way that all goes together is also really nice. I think this beer's had quite a bit of a long wort boil, because you can really smell, you do get a little bit of leatheriness out of the brown sugars in this one. So you can really smell that. It's a mix of that boozy, cakey, brown sugary, like brandy, fruit loaf type thing that you get out of this beer. There is a little touch of like a chocolatey cocoa nib kind of thing to it, but yeah, it's a very, other than that, you know, there's maybe a little touch of nuttiness to it, wee bit of woodiness too, but really the backbone of this beer is absolutely like just this, you know, treacly, brandy, woody, nutty fruit loaf type thing. That's really what you get out of this beer. It's really unusual, this. Yeah, the more that I smell of it, the brown sugars start to sweeten up a little bit. You do get an element of caramel out of it. There's a bit of that kind of toasty, roasty brown sugar to it. And yeah, I do like how this one goes together on the malty side of things. It's not like any Imperial Stout that I can think of that I've had in recent times. But yeah, to be honest with you, I think that covers everything we need to say about the malty side of this beer. I'm just very curious to see how that's going to transpire into the flavour of the beer. But let's take a look at the hoppy side of things and the fruity side of it and see what we get. So, yeah. Yeah, on the hoppy side of things, I think this beer, there's not too much going on in that sense. You do get a little bit of earthiness out of it. You get a little bit of, yeah, there's a little bit of earthiness to it. There's a wee bit of a floral aromaticity, and you've also got a kind of lighter, you do also have a little bit of a lighter kind of grassy thing in there as well. But yeah, the way that this goes together, I think is very, very nice. The hoppy side of the beer really does take a little bit of a back seat to everything else. But yeah, you would expect that from an Imperial Stout, especially one that is supposed to be a kind of pastry stout, a sweeter stout actually. So that absolutely makes sense. Wee touch of earthiness, a smooth floral note to it, but that again, very light in that sense and a wee bit of lighter grassiness. But yeah, let's focus on the fruity part of the beer. Let's focus on that. So yeah, fruity side of the beer, for me again, it's that whole sort of phenolic, medicinal type thing that you get out of this one. There's that dried, pruny, datey kind of vibe to the beer, that big fruit loafy kind of thing. There is a wee bit of an oily fig to it, a bit of a black currant, but I'm not getting the plums or the kind of blackberry. It really is like a dried kind of phenolic note. The fruity notes you get in this are actually quite similar to some of the big, Belgian strong dark ales and quadruples and stuff like that. It's almost like a hybrid, this beer, of in some ways it's like a stout and it is almost like a stout and a quadruple in a sense. It almost reminds me, to be honest with you, when I think about it, I've had one or two Belgian stouts. I have had one or two Belgian stouts before, and this beer in a sense really reminds me of some of those. It's a really interesting quirky aroma, this one. So as I always say, take a little bit of time and just enjoy the aroma of these beers before you get stuck into them, because you can find some really unusual things. And after 3,250 odd beer reviews, whatever it is now, having things like this is always really interesting. So yeah, take a little bit of time and enjoy that. But I think it's about time that we have a taste of this beer and see how we go. So yeah, this one is the Scarecrow, a 12.5% Imperial Stout. I've seen it listed as an Imperial Pastry Stout from 10 Hands Brewing in Karlstad in Värmland here in Sweden. Let's get stuck into this one and see how we go. Slange, skål, cheers. Ooh. That's pretty nice, I have to say. I'm going to say straight away as well, I like the flavour of this one more than I do the aroma. I have to be honest, I was a bit worried about this beer and what this beer was going to turn out like after I had a taste of it, and after I had a look at the aroma. But flavour wise, it is pretty nice. Let me give you a first impression then. So the basic first impression of this beer is when you take it in, it's really quite sweet and quite sticky. It does have some of that cakey element we were talking about in the flavour. It's a little bit drier, but very highly caramelised, very sort of cakey in its notes. You've got some nice dried red fruity character. The hops, of course, take a back seat. It is in a sense, it really does remind me of some of these Belgian stouts, but I can see the whole pastry stout side of things as well. But for me, this is really more like a kind of treacly, molassesy, brown sugary type stout, this one. I like it. I do like this beer, I have to say, so it gets a thumbs up from me. 10 Hands have done something a wee bit different here, and it's paid off. Like I say, not the biggest fan of the aroma of this one, but the flavour is really, really nice, I have to say. You get some beers like that you find really weird in the aroma, But yeah, I should point out as well, for those of you that haven't watched the channel for a fair bit of time, I'm not the greatest fan of pastry stouts, particularly the ones that have that kind of granola element to their flavour. But yeah, this one I think is quite nice. But let's break this beer down and describe it for you properly, as we always do. So we'll start in the middle third of the palate. One thing I will also say about this beer is that it's quite straight shooting. It's not the most complex of Imperial stouts, but I think it goes together pretty well. So middle third of the palate, you do get a little bit of a base of a kind of dry, like rye bready, fruit loafy kind of bread there. On top of that, you can feel like a more densified brown bready character to this one. But it really has kind of the sweetness and almost the texture of rye bread a little bit, but the flavour is just a wee bit different, because you are getting, for me, there's an inherent sort of phenolic fruitiness to this beer. So you've got the grainy sort of bread crusty edge to this one. You've got that dense, almost kind of rye bread-like texture on top. And then on top of all of that, you get this big, thick, sort of treacly molasses layer. As you go toward the kind of front, the front of that middle third of your palate, you will notice there are one or two little elements, pardon me, of woodiness in there. There's a little bit of woodiness toward the front of that, middle third of your palate. There's just a wee touch of nuttiness in there, but I would say that's really minimal. This beer, it's cakey, it's, you know, treacle and molasses and things like that. So as I say, that kind of slightly grainy bread crusty layer, like a thick almost rye bread note, but, you know, sweet on the thing, and then sweet, inherently sweet and fruity. Then on top of that you get that really thick brown sugary treacle molasses sort of layer. The interesting thing about the brown sugary notes in this is that it's not it really isn't it's not inherently leathery. Now if you got leathery notes out of the brown sugars in this beer, that would be an indicator of a long wort boil. But yeah, the treacly molasses thing you get out of this is inherently, it's just a big oily thing. It doesn't have that slightly leathery dryness that you get out of these beers quite often. The other thing that's interesting too is that this beer contains oats, which is common in pastry stouts, but you don't get that much of an oatiness out of this beer. So you've got that layer, that really thick oily brown sugary layer there. And you can feel that when you start in the dead centre of your palate, this is where the booze in the beer is concentrating. You get that really boozy alcoholic centre, and as you move further out from that, it does get a little bit sweeter, but you can feel the darker treacly molasses notes coming out a little bit more as you go further and further out toward the extremities of your palate. There is a wee bit of a just toasty character to this one, but yeah, I do like how this beer goes together. It's quite unusual. You've got this cakey backbone to it, then that big brown sugary note just sitting on top of that. It's interesting. Yeah, I mean, the other thing I will say about it is that the further you go into the aftertaste, you do get just a little touch of oatiness out of this one in the middle of your palate. But other than that, I don't think there's too much to say about this. It's really that cakey base and then the brown sugary layer. It's quite a simple stout, this, but the flavour is really nice. In a lot of ways, this beer actually feels a little bit like it's like a Belgian stout, it really feels a little bit more like a Belgian stout, but not quite as yeasty and bready. It's almost a little bit like you could say it's like a cross between like a quadruple and a Belgian stout in some ways. Really interesting beer, this one. I'm surprised, if I was to taste this blind, I think I probably would say it was a Belgian stout. I think it would be something like that, because it really is just quirky and you just get that phenolic flavour coming out of it. But let's focus on the back third of the palate then and see where we can go with this. But this is one of the more unusual beers I've had in recent times. So the border region between middle third and back third of your palate, you get a little bit of a kind of bread, you get a little touch of a bready, bread crusty, cakey build up in there, but then back third of the palate is kind of similar. You do get a slightly more bitter and grainy bread crusty note. On top of that, you get a slightly thicker brown bread, like sort of brown bready, cakey layer in there, and it is just a wee bit more bitter. You can feel some of the brown sugars creeping into that back third of the palate as well, and they're a bit more kind of roasty and toasty. On top of all of that, you do get a bit of a yeasty element to the beer, so you can feel like it's a more dense, doughy, brown bready sort of thing, and then it's got that grainy bread crust around it as well. But other than that, as I say, I don't think there's too much to report. The only other thing I would say is that the further you go into the aftertaste with this beer, on the back third and middle third of your palate, you do get a little bit of a more woody note out of this beer, and a bit of that drier kind of cakey note. It's almost like, you know, when you scrape the edge off the baking tray when you've got one of these brown sugary caramel roll things. That's what you really get out of this one. But yeah, I like it. So back third of the palate, you can feel the flavour is a little bit taller. It's a little bit taller on that back third of the palate. Then as you come further forward, it just densifies a little bit, and you can feel the flavours are a wee bit more kind of squashed together. But yeah, back third and middle third of the palate in this one, I think is really, really nicely done. Let's focus on the hoppy and fruity side of the beer then. So, back corners of the palate, you have a nice little bit of earthiness there. As you move further forward, yeah, a little bit of earthiness. But yeah, as you move further forward, it has a little touch of herbal character, and as you push toward the front corners of the palate, it has a wee bit of a kind of floral note to it. The hops in this one are a wee bit more present, I think, in the flavour than they were in the aroma. Maybe I'm drinking this beer a little bit fresh. I don't know if it has a canned on date. 2026, 131. So yeah, they're recommending you can leave this one in the can for about like 4 years or something like that. I'm not 100% sure, but yeah, obviously I'm not sure how fresh this beer is exactly, but you still get a little bit of the hoppy note out of this. Of course, when it's 12.5%, you can leave it for a little bit and it's going to be fine, and the hoppy notes will drop out. But yeah, it's got quite an oily floral note to it, but round the front curve of the palate, it's a wee bit lighter and grassy. There's a teeny bit of zestiness in there still, but again, it's quite an oily green component that you get with this one. But the focus is, of course, on that malty, cakey, brown sugary side of things. Let's focus on the front third of the palate and the fruitiness, though, to round off the flavour section. So, the front third of your palate in this beer, the border region between front third and middle third of your palate, you get a little bit of that big, cakey, you get a little bit of that oily, cakey, it's almost brownie-like in a sense, like a brownie fruit loaf mix there. But then the base of that front third of your palate, there's a smooth brown bready, and sort of you still get some of that big oily brown sugary character there. That's the base of the front third of your palate. On top of that, though, you get that nice oily bubble where the juicy, fruity character just rolls its way out of the beer. But yeah, I do like how that goes together in this one as well. It's really just a very quirky beer, this one. So, fruity side of things then. When you take the beer in, it has a wee bit of that raisiny sharpness, but mainly it's an oily kind of plummy note. But the base of the fruity character in that beer, it's very dry. You know, you get the prunes, yeah, you get a little bit of a pruny character, you get there's a wee bit of pruniness, a bit of datiness, and then some sultana notes there. So there's a bit of raisin, an oily plum, underneath that a drier prune, as we say, sultanas, and a few other things in there as well. But yeah, as you move further forward into the middle of that front third of your tongue, you start to get the kind of sultana type notes, and it really is quite, it's interesting. I get a lot of that kind of sultana note going further into the aftertaste with this. There's maybe a wee touch of like black currant or blackberry in there just at the very front tip of the tongue, but really you'll notice a lot of these phenolic, dry, fruity notes coming out of this one. It's like sort of brandy or maybe cognac, something like that. A few things going on in this beer too. The other thing that comes to mind with this beer, I don't smoke. I've never taken a drag of a cigarette in my life, but I've smelt tobacco. We did things with tobacco in the lab, and the sort of flavour that you're getting out of this one is, it reminds me of the smell of, like, you know, the tobacco that you use to roll your cigarettes and stuff like that. That's, you know, you get quite a little bit of that out of this beer, and the flavour as well. The further you go into the aftertaste, those brown treacly molasses sugars come out of this one really, really nicely. But yeah, I think that's everything we need to say about the flavour of this beer. So we can round off, I think, with the mouthfeel. This really is, it's like a combination of like a really long boil quadruple and a Belgian stout. That's what this beer really, really reminds me of in a lot of ways. I'd be very curious to see the recipe of this one. So, mouthfeel wise, full bodied, there's no doubt in my mind about that. The carbonation is very, very smooth. It's a big oily thing, this beer, but yeah, I think that works for it. IBU wise, this beer has a good bit of dryness to it, but I don't think that necessarily translates to bitterness. I think it's probably about a standard, 20 IBUs, but as I say, you do get a bit of woodiness and a bit of cakiness and dryness and stuff like that out of the beer. So yeah, it has got an inherent dryness to it, but I don't think it's overly high in terms of its IBUs, about 20 or so. The malt base, as we say, a bit dry, big and thick and oily, but it does have a bit of sweetness to it as well. I think that's fair to say. The fruity side of the beer's got a wee touch of sharpness to it, but again, it's quite dry and phenolic in a lot of ways. Yeah, this is just a really big, big oily beer. It really is, to me, it's more reminiscent of a quadruple, and the mouthfeel is very similar to what you'd expect of a quadruple, or something like this. It's really along those kind of lines. But yeah, a really, really interesting beer, and I have enjoyed it. The aroma, I was a bit suspect of this. I was a bit suspicious of this one because it was smelling a bit suspect, but I have enjoyed this, I have to say. This is quite a quirky beer from 10 Hands. Yeah, and as I say, if I was to taste it blind, I would describe it as being like a Belgian stout, but almost as well like a very long boil, highly caramelized quadruple, or like a dark Belgian dark strong ale, whatever you want to call it. It's something like that. Castile Donker. It's not a million miles away from that, but just a wee bit more dark, if you like. So yeah, I have to say, thumbs up to 10 Hands. They've pulled off an interesting beer here, but I think we can round off this review there. So yeah, let's leave it at that for this one then. This was the Scarecrow, a 12.5% Imperial Stout. I think a Belgian stout, as I've said a few times in this video, from 10 Hands Brewing in Karlstad on the banks of Värmland here in Sweden. So yeah, once again, thank you for watching my beer reviews. Until the next time, please like, subscribe, share, all the usual YouTube stuff. Let me know your own thoughts on this beer in the comment section below. Let me know what your favourite beers are from 10 Hands Brewing as well, and we will no doubt return to these guys at some point in the near future. But until the next time, check out my social media, check out 10 Hands Brewing social media, and I'll see you soon. Slàinte, skål, cheers, catch you guys in the next review.